Jonathan Blake was one step away from boarding his private jet when three identical little girls tugged at his sleeve and whispered one word that stopped his entire world: help. Jonathan Blake moved with purpose through the private terminal, his phone pressed to his ear, his suitcase wheeling behind him with a soft hum against the polished floor. His assistant was still reading off updates about an investor dinner he would now miss in London, but he wasn't listening anymore. He was already halfway up the steps to his jet, mentally reviewing the presentation he planned to revise during the flight. Time was always tight, and his world, shaped by deals, deadlines, and departures, never paused long enough for second thoughts. The flight crew waited at the top of the stairs, nodding professionally as he approached. The pilot was checking his watch. Everything was perfectly on schedule. Then, just as Jonathan placed one foot on the top step, he felt a small tug on his sleeve. He turned sharply, expecting perhaps a staff member with a last-minute document or a delay announcement. But what he saw made him freeze in place. Three little girls stood on the tarmac below, barely tall enough to reach his waist. They looked about 5 years old and were nearly identical, triplets with long blonde hair, light blue eyes, and simple pale red dresses paired with mismatched sneakers. Their faces were pale, their hands clutched tightly together, and their gazes fixed firmly on him with a kind of desperate determination that didn't belong to children that young. The smallest one stepped forward and, in a trembling voice, said only one word. Help. For a brief second, Jonathan wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Everything around him, the engines, the wind, the calls from the ground crew, faded into silence. He stepped down from the stairs, instinct taking over where logic hesitated. He crouched to their level, looking into the eyes of the one who had spoken. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, careful not to frighten them. The answer came quickly, from all three at once: "We don't know." The pilot called out something from the stairs behind him, reminding him they were ready for takeoff, but Jonathan didn't turn around. His mind was no longer in the sky. It was grounded entirely in that moment, in the three frightened faces in front of him, in the way their small shoulders rose and fell with nervous breath. These children weren't just lost. They were alone. He reached for his phone again, not to respond to the dozen unread messages about contracts and schedules, but to cancel the flight. It took less than a minute. Then he stood up, took a deep breath, and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said softly. And without hesitation, each girl reached out. One hand. Then another. Then the third. They walked with him toward the terminal, away from the aircraft, away from whatever he thought had been urgent. For the first time in years, Jonathan Blake was running late. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care. Inside the quiet terminal, Jonathan led the three girls to a bench near the large windows overlooking the tarmac. Outside, his private jet remained on standby, the crew uncertain, but he gave them no further instructions. His focus was entirely on the children. They sat close together, knees touching, holding hands as if letting go would make them disappear. Despite their matching appearance, each girl had subtle differences. One had a tiny scar near her eyebrow, another clutched the hem of her dress with nervous fingers, and the third kept her eyes fixed on the floor, as if staring hard enough might keep her from crying. Jonathan crouched again, trying to appear smaller, less intimidating. He wasn't used to comforting children. He wasn't used to being this close to fear he couldn't fix with money or negotiation. Gently, he asked, "Can you tell me your names?" The girl on the left answered first. "I'm Emily." "I'm Sophie," said the one in the middle, her voice softer than a whisper. "And I'm Mia," added the third, finally glancing up at him. He repeated their names aloud, trying to commit them to memory. Emily, Sophie, Mia. That's easy to remember. "Are you the airport boss?" Emily asked suddenly, her blue eyes wide and searching. Jonathan shook his head with a small smile. "No. Just someone who was about to fly away. But you stopped me." Mia bit her lip. We didn't mean to be bad." "You weren't bad," he said gently. "You were brave." Sophie turned slightly toward him. "Our mommy got sick. She fell down at the airport and they took her in the loud car. They said we couldn't go. But we didn't want to stay with the people in the uniforms." Jonathan's chest tightened. "An ambulance?" All three nodded in sync. He leaned back on his heels and exhaled slowly, realizing they had likely escaped the temporary care of airport security or even a child protection officer. And somehow, instead of running away, they had stayed close to the jet they saw first, his. They had chosen him without knowing anything about him. "Do you know your mom's name?" he asked carefully. "Eleanor Harper," said Emily. Jonathan's head snapped up. The name hit him like a wave of cold air. He hadn't heard it in years. Eleanor. Ellie. The woman he'd walked away from when his ambition won out over his heart. She was the one that lingered in old letters he never deleted and photographs he never framed. He hadn't known she had children. He hadn't even known she was still in the same city. He stood slowly and pulled out his phone, calling his assistant with clipped instructions to locate all recent hospital intakes under the name Eleanor Harper. While he waited, he bought the girls bottles of water and a small box of crackers from a vending machine. They ate quietly, feet swinging above the floor, watching him with curiosity but not fear. 15 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Eleanor Harper had been admitted to a nearby hospital just 30 minutes earlier. She was unconscious and listed in serious condition. There was no emergency contact listed. He looked at the girls again. They weren't just lost. They were alone in the world, and they didn't even realize the weight of that yet. Jonathan knelt down in front of them again. "Your mom is at the hospital. I'm going to take you there, okay? I'll make sure you're safe." They didn't hesitate. Emily stood first and reached for his hand. The other two followed. As he walked them to his car, his mind raced, but not about work. He wasn't thinking about the deals he had abandoned or the flight he had cancelled. All he could think about was the name he had just heard, the three girls beside him, and the sinking, impossible thought forming in his chest: what if they were his? The ride to the hospital was quiet except for the soft humming of the car engine and the occasional rustle of candy wrappers as the girls quietly shared the crackers Jonathan had given them. He drove more slowly than usual, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, where the three little girls sat huddled together in the back seat. Emily had leaned her head on Sophie's shoulder, and Mia looked out the window with a distant expression, her small fingers tracing patterns in the condensation. It struck Jonathan how natural they were around each other, how they moved like one gentle, bonded unit. It was a kind of closeness he had never seen, even among siblings he had known growing up. He couldn't stop glancing at them, wondering how they came from Eleanor, who had once called him the most distant person she had ever loved. The name alone stirred something sharp and old inside him. They hadn't spoken in years. Their breakup had been final, painful, and completely silent. She hadn't chased him when he left, and he never looked back. He had told himself it was better that way, that their worlds had never aligned. And now, she was in a hospital, unconscious, with three daughters who might, somehow, be his. The moment he pulled up to the hospital entrance, a nurse rushed forward with a look of confusion and recognition. She had clearly been briefed about the missing children. Jonathan quickly explained the situation, stating that he had found the girls alone and that they had mentioned their mother by name. The nurse's expression shifted from stern to soft, and she guided them toward a quiet area away from the main ER. While the girls waited with a hospital social worker, Jonathan requested to see Eleanor. He didn't know what kind of reception to expect. Part of him feared she would wake up and want nothing to do with him. Another part of him feared she wouldn't wake up at all. When he stepped into her room, the sound of the door closing behind him seemed deafening. She lay motionless, pale against the stark white of the hospital linens. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, but her face was gaunt, her features thinner than he remembered. A heart monitor beeped softly in the background, the only proof that time was still moving forward. He stood there for a long moment, unable to take a single step. Then he walked to the side of the bed and sat down slowly in the chair beside her. He didn't reach for her hand right away. Instead, he studied her face, searching for the woman he once knew, the one who had laughed so loudly it startled him, who had challenged every choice he made with a strength he hadn't known how to love. Finally, he whispered, "Ellie, it's me. Jonathan." The sound of his own voice felt strange in the still room. He glanced toward the window, unsure of what he expected. "I saw them. The girls. They found me before I could leave. Just showed up like they knew I had to stop." His voice cracked, and he didn't bother trying to hide it. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever reach out? You knew I would have come." His fingers clenched the edge of the chair. "You knew I had the right to know." He looked at her again, but her eyes remained closed, her breathing unchanged. He sat there until the nurse returned and gently reminded him the children were asking for him. When he stepped into the hallway, he found the girls sitting on a bench, still in their red dresses, looking even smaller under the weight of the fluorescent lights. Mia was holding a crayon drawing she had made on a clipboard, 3 stick girls holding hands with a tall figure beside them, all smiling under a big yellow sun. "She's still sleeping," he said gently as he approached. "But she's safe. The doctors are doing everything they can." "Will she wake up?" Sophie asked quietly. Jonathan didn't lie. "I hope so. And I'm going to stay here with you until she does." He sat down beside them, not as a businessman or a stranger, but as a man who had suddenly been handed a fragile, unplanned future. One he wasn't ready for, but one he already couldn't walk away from. The hospital became their temporary home, though none of them ever said it out loud. Jonathan checked into a nearby hotel suite but barely spent any time there, choosing instead to remain at the hospital where the girls felt safest. Every morning began the same way. The girls would shuffle into Eleanor's room in their borrowed pajamas, whispering to her softly as if their voices alone could coax her awake. Nurses brought them small breakfasts, crayons, and coloring books to keep them occupied, and Jonathan sat with his laptop, not working so much as pretending to, his mind too clouded with questions that no spreadsheet could solve. Eleanor remained unconscious. The doctors explained that she had suffered a severe head injury, likely from fainting and hitting the tiled airport floor. There was no brain swelling, but her recovery depended on time and rest. She was stable, and that alone gave Jonathan a fragile thread of hope. He clung to it, even when he didn't know why. The girls, meanwhile, were adapting with a resilience he didn't expect. They weren't loud or overly emotional, but rather carried a quiet determination that made them seem older than they were. Emily took on a protective, almost maternal role. Sophie was the softest, the most anxious, always looking to the others before speaking. Mia, the smallest, had begun drawing more and more, her pages now filled with smiling families and suns and hearts. And often, she included Jonathan, sometimes with messy brown hair and a tie, sometimes holding all 3 girls' hands. One afternoon, as they sat in the waiting room while Eleanor underwent another scan, Emily climbed into the chair beside Jonathan and asked, "Did you know our mom before?" The question made him freeze, then carefully close his laptop. "Yes. A long time ago." Emily studied his face. "Did you love her?" He didn't flinch. "I did." "Did she love you?" she asked next, and her voice was not accusing, only curious, as if she had a right to know, because she did. "I think she did," he answered honestly. "But I left. I thought I had to. And that was a mistake." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She told us our dad was far away. That he didn't know about us. But that one day, he might come." Jonathan looked at her, stunned. "She said that?" Emily nodded. "Not all the time. Just once. When Mia asked why we didn't have a daddy. Jonathan leaned forward, the weight of that simple truth sinking deep into his chest. Eleanor had never told him. She'd never reached out. But she had still left that door open, in their hearts, just wide enough for him to step through if he ever found his way back. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a quiet corner of the pediatric lounge, Jonathan sat alone in Eleanor's room. He watched the monitors pulse gently, the oxygen tube rising and falling with her breath. In her silence, he found himself speaking aloud to her more and more. "I met them, Ellie. They're beautiful. Brave. Smart. So much like you it scares me. I don't know if I'm ready for what comes next. But I know I can't walk away this time." He reached out and took her hand carefully in his. "You should have told me. I would have come. I still came, though. Maybe a little late. But I'm here now. And I'm staying." The light in the room was low, shadows stretching across the floor, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. He thought he saw her fingers twitch, but maybe that was just his imagination. Still, he didn't let go. When morning came, the girls ran into the room as always. Mia climbed onto the edge of the bed and whispered, "Good morning, Mommy. We brought you drawings." And Jonathan, watching her tiny fingers carefully tuck the picture under Eleanor's pillow, realized something that shook him deeply. He was no longer a man waiting to see what his place would be. He already belonged here. On the 5th day, something changed, not in Eleanor's condition, which remained still and silent, but in Jonathan. The routine that once felt foreign was now instinct. He knew how each of the girls liked their cereal in the morning, how to braid Sophie's hair just tight enough so it wouldn't unravel, and how to find Mia's missing crayon colors with a calm he never thought himself capable of. But it wasn't only about logistics. It was the quiet shift inside him, the way he began to speak to the nurses not as someone asking for updates, but as someone who belonged in the conversation. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. Work calls went unanswered. For the first time since he had built his empire, Jonathan Blake was nowhere else but here. That morning, the girls were invited by the pediatric counselor to spend time in the hospital's playroom. It was the first time they were separated from Eleanor's room for more than a few minutes. Jonathan agreed, though he felt uneasy watching them disappear around the corner without him. He turned back to Eleanor's bedside, the silence in the room almost too much after the days filled with whispers and movement. He sat down beside her and took a breath. "I've never said this before," he began softly, his hand lightly resting on the edge of the blanket near hers. "But I want to say it now. In case you can hear me." He wasn't used to speaking without expecting a reply, but the quiet no longer scared him. He told her about the first moment he saw the girls, how they had stopped him with one word. He told her about their favorite snacks, about the picture books they insisted on reading every night, and about the tiny little freckle behind Sophie's ear that made them all laugh. He talked until his throat was dry, not because he needed answers, but because he wanted her to know everything she might have missed in these few days. Later that afternoon, after he'd stepped out for a coffee, the head nurse approached him. Her expression was neutral but alert. "Mr. Blake, the girls' paperwork with the hospital lists you as their emergency contact now. I just want to confirm that's accurate." He paused, then nodded. "It is. Has Child Protective Services contacted you?" He exhaled slowly. "Not yet." She lowered her voice. "They will. If Eleanor doesn't wake up soon, the girls may be moved into temporary care. Unless you're willing to step in formally." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever I have to." The nurse nodded approvingly. "Then I'd recommend speaking with a family attorney today." He made the call that evening, sitting in a quiet hallway while the girls watched cartoons in the family lounge. The lawyer he'd worked with for years answered immediately, but this time their conversation was different. Jonathan wasn't calling to protect assets or dissolve a partnership. He was calling to become a guardian. A father. A man with something to lose. By nightfall, the first documents were already being prepared. He didn't know how long it would take to finalize, but he didn't care. He would fight if he had to. Not because he owed it to Eleanor, or to make up for lost time, but because in just a few days, those 3 girls had shown him a version of himself he never believed existed. Back in the hospital room, as the lights dimmed and the machines continued their steady rhythm, Jonathan watched Mia fall asleep with her head on Eleanor's shoulder, her small hand curled into the sheet. Sophie leaned against him, blinking slowly, and Emily whispered, "Will she wake up soon?" Jonathan looked at her, his voice steady. "I believe she will. And when she does, we'll all be right here." He didn't say it as a promise. He said it as a fact. Because somehow, this was no longer about what might happen. It was about what already had. The 6th day began like the others had, quiet, slow, and full of uncertain hope, but there was a different weight in the air, something more fragile. Jonathan stood at the large window in the hospital hallway, staring down at the parking lot below as the first light of morning painted the cars in a dull gray. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he hadn't noticed. His mind was too full. The guardianship documents had been delivered that morning, and with one signature, everything would change. Legally, permanently. He had gone from being a stranger to a man prepared to raise 3 little girls on his own. The thought should have terrified him, but it didn't. What terrified him now was the idea of losing them. Inside Eleanor's room, the girls had made a routine of sitting around her bed, talking to her as though she were listening. Emily told her about a funny nurse who made balloon animals. Sophie described a dream she'd had about a flying cat. Mia, always quiet, just drew pictures and laid them on the blanket one by one. Jonathan watched from the doorway, amazed at how natural it had become to see them there, how much they belonged. Every gesture, every word, every glance between them was filled with a kind of unspoken understanding, a closeness he had never witnessed before. The doctor came in later that morning, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. Jonathan followed him into the hallway, heart tightening. The words were clinical at first: stabilized vitals, minimal swelling, consistent patterns on the EEG, but then the doctor paused and looked directly at him. "She may wake up soon. Possibly within the next 24 hours. Jonathan didn't breathe for a second. He had prepared himself for everything except good news. And if she does? She'll likely be disoriented. Memory gaps are possible, but it's too early to know. The important thing is that she has people here. Familiar voices. Faces. That matters more than you think." He nodded, thanked the doctor, and returned to the room, where the girls had begun playing a quiet game of cards on the floor. He crouched beside them and shared the news in a calm, steady tone. Their eyes lit up, but they didn't shout or jump. Instead, they turned to their mother and quietly said, "Did you hear that, Mommy? We're still here." That afternoon, Jonathan found himself pacing in the hallway, unable to sit still. He called the attorney again, confirming the next steps. He spoke with the social worker who had begun visiting daily, providing her with every detail she needed. He made arrangements to transfer Eleanor to a private room with more comfort, and he even reached out to a former business contact who specialized in long-term care, just in case. But when evening fell, all the preparation faded behind one simple moment. Mia, who had curled up beside Eleanor's arm as usual, suddenly gasped. Emily rushed to the bed. Sophie stood frozen. Jonathan moved quickly, thinking something was wrong, until he saw it. Eleanor's fingers had moved. Slight, shaky, but unmistakable. Then her eyelids fluttered once, then again, before slowly beginning to open. He stepped forward just as the girls leaned in, whispering her name like a prayer. "Mommy. Mommy, we're here." Eleanor blinked at the ceiling, her brow furrowing as though trying to focus through a fog. Her lips parted slightly, dry and unsure. Jonathan felt his heart race as he took her hand gently. "Ellie," he said softly. "It's me. Jonathan. The girls are safe. You're safe." She turned her head slowly, eyes finding him, confused but present. Her gaze drifted to the three small faces clustered around her, and something in her expression shifted. A tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered, barely audible, "You found them." Jonathan nodded, voice tight. "They found me." And just like that, the impossible distance between past and present began to close. She was awake. The girls were safe. And Jonathan knew with certainty, this wasn't the end of a story. It was the start of a new one. Eleanor's return to consciousness was not instant clarity but a slow and uneven climb from the darkness. The first few hours after she awoke were filled with confusion and fatigue, her words slurred, her memory coming in fragments. The doctors assured Jonathan this was expected and that recovery would take time. But to the girls, it didn't matter. Their mother had opened her eyes, had looked at them and spoken their names. That was all they needed. They stayed close to her side, whispering, drawing, and resting their heads on her blanket when she drifted back into shallow sleep. Jonathan remained in the background, both relieved and unsettled. Seeing Eleanor alive, speaking, reacting, it brought back a storm of emotions he thought he had buried. He wasn't sure where he stood in her life now, but he knew where he stood in the lives of the girls. He wasn't going anywhere. That truth had become part of him. Later that evening, the room was dim and quiet when Eleanor asked the question he had been expecting. Her voice was thin but clear. "How did you find them?" He sat down in the chair beside her bed, watching her carefully. The girls were asleep nearby, curled together on a sofa like a pile of kittens. He told her everything, from the moment on the runway to the hospital to the hearing he had scheduled with his lawyer. She listened with wide, tearful eyes, her expression shifting from disbelief to something more painful. "I never meant to keep them from you," she said softly. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You had made your choice, and I thought it would only hurt more to chase you down." Jonathan lowered his head. "I didn't know how to stay, Ellie. I didn't think I could be both, someone you loved and someone who wanted more from the world. So I left, thinking it was the least damaging thing I could do." She smiled faintly. "And now?" He looked at her without hesitation. "Now I know I was wrong. And I'm here. I've been here." Eleanor reached out slowly and took his hand. Her grip was weak, but intentional. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "But I stopped waiting." Jonathan swallowed the emotion that threatened to rise in his throat. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to get better. And I want them to have a future. If you let me, I'll be part of it." They sat in silence for a long moment, fingers still laced together. Outside the window, the city lights flickered, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in that small hospital room. The next day, the doctor cleared Eleanor to begin light physical therapy. Jonathan brought in clothes for her, comfortable, simple, and helped the girls prepare a room in the recovery ward with drawings and cards. Emily insisted on hanging a paper heart above the bed that read, "Welcome back, Mommy," in uneven handwriting. Sophie taped stars along the windowsill. Mia placed a small stuffed bear beside the pillow and whispered, "So you don't feel alone." Later that afternoon, Eleanor was transferred to the new room. She moved slowly but with determination, and Jonathan pushed the wheelchair with care, every turn deliberate. When they entered the decorated room, she stopped and covered her mouth with her hand, eyes welling with tears. "They did this?" she asked. "All on their own," he said. "They wanted you to feel home again." She looked around, then up at him. "What about you, Jonathan? Do you feel like you're home?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, then at the girls busying themselves with books and crayons in the corner. His chest tightened, not from uncertainty, but from something deeper and truer. "Yes," he said. "For the first time, I think I do." The weeks that followed were a delicate blend of healing, change, and quiet transformation. Eleanor's strength returned gradually. With each physical therapy session, her movements became steadier, her voice clearer, and her memory more reliable. The girls adjusted to her slower pace with surprising maturity, often helping her reach for things, brushing her hair gently in the mornings, and keeping her company through the long stretches of rest. They had waited for her to wake up, and now that she had, they moved through every moment with a kind of reverence, as if the simplest tasks had become sacred simply because they could share them again. Jonathan remained a constant presence, not because he felt obligated, but because he didn't want to be anywhere else. Every morning he arrived at the hospital early enough to join them for breakfast, bringing coffee for Eleanor and cereal for the girls. He learned how to braid hair and how to answer the same bedtime question 3 different ways. His days were no longer defined by flights, deadlines, or contracts, but by slow walks down hospital corridors, reading picture books out loud, and sitting beside Eleanor as they talked quietly about the years they had missed and the days still ahead. One evening, while the girls were playing in the hospital garden under the watchful eye of a nurse, Eleanor asked him to take a walk with her. She was still using a cane, but her steps were steady. They made their way slowly down the garden path, the fading light casting long shadows across the stone. She didn't speak right away, and he didn't rush her. Eventually, she stopped beside a bench and sat down, looking at the sky. "I thought I was going to die," she said softly. "And the last thing I remember thinking was that I'd failed them. That they would be alone. I didn't know they'd find you." Jonathan sat beside her. "I didn't know they existed. But now that I do, I won't lose them. Or you." She looked at him, and the weariness in her face was replaced by something gentler. "What happens next?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is a copy of the guardianship papers. The judge approved them. But I didn't file them yet. I wanted to wait for you. If you're ready, we can do it together. As a family." Her eyes welled up. She took the envelope carefully, holding it in both hands. "You've changed. I've finally figured out what matters." That weekend, Eleanor was discharged from the hospital. Jonathan helped her and the girls settle into a temporary rental house just outside the city. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a small yard, bright windows, and 3 bedrooms, one for each girl. They filled the space with drawings, soft music, and the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. Every night, Jonathan stayed for dinner. Some nights, he didn't leave at all. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly found its rhythm. Eleanor continued to recover, stronger each day. The girls enrolled in a small local school, where they quickly made friends. Jonathan adjusted to balancing business calls between ballet recitals and pediatric appointments. He built a home not out of wealth, but out of presence, effort, and forgiveness. One Sunday morning, they visited the lake, the same lake from Eleanor's painting, the one that had unknowingly started it all. They stood together at the shore, the girls running along the edge, skipping stones and laughing. Jonathan and Eleanor watched them from a distance, hands quietly intertwined. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't stopped you that day?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "And every day, I thank whatever force in the universe put them in my path." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "They saved us both." He nodded, knowing it was true. They had pulled him off a flight to a life that no longer fit and led him straight into the one he was always meant to live. And this time, he wasn't leaving. The ending of this story feels quietly powerful because it doesn't rely on dramatic twists or grand gestures, it's built on growth, choice, and redemption. What stands out most is that Jonathan doesn't become a different person overnight. He doesn't abandon his identity or erase his past mistakes. Instead, he makes a conscious, steady decision to show up, for Eleanor, for the girls, and for himself, in a way he never had before. That's what makes the transformation so believable and so moving. Eleanor's recovery is treated with realism, and the way the family rebuilds around her isn't sugar-coated. It's full of uncertainty, awkwardness, and effort, but that's what gives the story its strength. The most touching element is that the children, despite their vulnerability, are the ones who guide the adults toward healing. They become the bridge between two people with a complicated past, and they do it not with intention, but with innocence and trust. In the end, this story isn't just about lost love or unexpected fatherhood, it's about finding purpose in connection, and realizing that sometimes the life you never planned becomes the life you were always meant to lead. It's a hopeful reminder that second chances don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, they come in the form of small hands, quiet questions, and the courage to stay.